On that day, Mwalimu was invited to talk about African unity, and he titled his presentation, "Without Unity, Africa Has No Future." And Mwalimu said that when we think about the continent of Africa, we are united by the fact that over the centuries, we were hunted down as slaves. And after we had been enslaved for 400 years, we were colonized, and that our enslavement and our colonization became the glory of other civilizations. He went on to say, it is therefore incumbent upon us to recognize that our unity is the only salvation and the only immunity that we can have if we are to protect ourselves against other civilizations. He went on to say that it was not lost on him that Ghana was on that day celebrating her 40th anniversary. He was equally happy to record that he was speaking in Accra, which was the capital of pan-Africanism. He reminded his audience that in the month of February 1994, the process of liberation had been completed with the conquest of the apartheid regime in South Africa and the rise of Nelson Mandela to the presidency of that nation. He went on to say and to admit that Africans had been wrong not to unite. He went on to say that Nkrumah had been right in demanding as early as 1957 that Africans had to unite. That story is important because it underscores the significance of African unity as a condition sine qua non to the progress of Africa. But one cannot start the conversation of African unity without going back to history. Many of us will remember that the very first idea of what may now be described as modern-day Pan-Africanism was in the year 1897, when that great Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams convened a meeting of the African Association, later to be called the Pan-African Association. Williams, at that time, had tried to persuade the Africans in the diaspora that they had a duty to ensure that going forward, they were not oblivious to the plight of their kin and kith in the continent of Africa. But even Williams had been animated by the early works of Marcus Garvey. You will remember as early as the year 1820, Marcus Garvey had started his movement back to Africa. And Marcus was reacting to slavery, which had been dehumanizing. And he was telling the blacks, we must go back to our mother continent, regardless of which countries we came from, because these countries that now constituted the continent of Africa were rudely divided by the Europeans in Berlin in 1884, a little later. But what is significant about the Marcus Garvey movement, although it was labeled a failure, is that when the blacks in the continent of America heard about those efforts, it energized the abolitionist movement. And therefore, by 1863, when Abraham Lincoln was signing the Proclamation Treaty, it was as much a contribution of the uncelebrated efforts of people like Marcus Garvey. But Marcus Garvey aside, it is Williams from Trinidad whose activities spawned modern-day Pan-Africanism. And we remember that Williams, in the year 1900, organized a meeting in London. And that meeting held in London and organized by that great man was the beginning of the efforts towards bringing Africans, irrespective of where they were geographically resident, to talk about Africa. The 1900 meeting was followed by yet another meeting in 1919. And that meeting was organized by yet another great African and great Pan-Africanist, W.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois was telling his audience at that time that our kith and kin in the continent have been enslaved. Our kith and kin have been colonized. And if we do not support them, they'll not regain their independence. The 1919 meeting was followed once again by the 1921 meeting and 1923 meetings, both held in London. And ultimately, in 1927, there was a meeting in New York. But the most critical meeting for Pan-Africanism, at least the one that we can relate to in the continent of Africa, was in 1945, that was held in Manchester in the United Kingdom. Why I think that that was very significant, because Africans were represented there. Kwame Nkrumah represented Ghana at that meeting. Peter Abrahams was present from South Africa. Hastings Ngwazi Kamuzubanda was present from Malawi. Jomo Kenyatta was present from Kenya. Obafemi Awolowo was present from Nigeria. And there were representation from Jamaica and from Trinidad and from the United States of America. The 1945 meeting was critical because at that time, all African countries were under the tutelage of colonization, except for Ethiopia and Liberia. Liberia having been established as a settlement for freed slaves in 1847, and Ethiopia, of course, through the exploits of Emperor Menelik, had defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa and were never, therefore, successfully colonized. After 1945, the struggle for independence was moving in earnest, and I think that the World War had helped in this regard. The freedom of India in 1947 had also helped in making colonization as a form of control to be one that was not very attractive to the colonizing powers. A lot of activities are taking place, and Africa is getting undermined. At that time, in 1963, there are 32 independent African countries. What then begins to happen after 1965? 1965 is a marker year, because in 1965, Kwame Nkrumah convenes a meeting in Accra, Ghana. And the meeting had two agenda items. Agenda item number one, that we must leave Accra with a united government. Having failed in 1963, we must leave with a united government. Agenda item number two, that we must not forget that there are some African countries which are still under the colonial yoke. And it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we begin to move in the direction of guaranteeing their independence. But unfortunately, once again, Kwame Nkrumah did not carry the day. And what ended up happening is that the African Liberation Movement is what was established. And ultimately, the Organization of African Unity did accept to form the African Liberation Committee, which was to be headquartered in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. But it is critical at that time that the colonialists have started to invade Africa in a very subtle way. The French are active, the British are active, the Portuguese have yet to yield their colonies in Africa, namely Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. They are still under the Portuguese tutelage. Equatorial Guinea has also not been freed from the yoke of the Spaniards. Africa is in a very dangerous state. And yet again, it is the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah, whose name I shall pronounce and state ad nauseum today, because actually he is the high priest of Pan-Africanism. The Osagie writes a book, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism. Once again, he is warning the people that we cannot afford the luxury of resting on our laurels.
Just a little, you heard very well the speech from Professor PLO LUMUMBA, and he said the former president of Tanzania and former president of Ghana and so many leaders, even now, we say Africa without uniting, we can't achieve that we plan for our continent. We can't achieve Agenda 2033. We can't achieve in full that level that we want in this continental free trade area. Also, we can't achieve having one currency. We can't achieve having one judiciary, one bank, one leader if we are not decided to unite. We have been talking too much, and our founding fathers, they talk about this issue, and they did their role at that time. I believe that to take this continent in the hands of Africans. Now, we current generation, we have the role which is to unite the continent of Africa and have and share everything that states must share. So this, I think, and I believe that it's only way, or it's only method that we can use for we Africans to have what we need by through uniting. So, brothers and sisters, I don't have many things to speak in this video, but I wish you, African diaspora in the continent, please share your thoughts on the speech from Professor PLO Lumumba about the unity of Africa. Sons and daughters, kings and queens, brothers and sisters, this is your platform. This is our platform where we share thoughts and ideas about our mother continent, Africa, and sometimes we provide solution of our own problem. We know that African problem for African solution. Thank you. Let us meet on the next episode.